Hi guys, and welcome back to Duralex Said Lex. I'm Alyssa.
And I'm Anna.
And today we're going to be talking about environmental law with Dr. Squintani, professor at the University of Groningen. We're going to be delving into the world of sustainability, environmental law at the European and international level, and we're going to be talking about types of renewable energies in order from most to least sustainable. We're also going to be talking about the effectiveness of laws and the struggles of environmental law as it is now. We're going to be talking about the Green Deal and the COP26 convention of last year, how environmental issues can be solved at both national and international levels. So yeah, bear with us because this is going to be very interesting, and we'll see you at the outro.
So, could you please introduce yourself to listeners that may not know you yet and what your research expertise is?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lorenzo Squintani, professor of energy law here at the University of Groningen Faculty of Law and director of the Groningen Center of Energy Law and Sustainability, better said, co-director. Indeed, also responsible for environmental law and sustainability law courses at our faculty.
So, looking at your most recent work that you wrote in around 2021, addressing legal barriers to sustainability in the European Union, could you please explain to us what sustainability actually is and how it interlinks with EU environmental law, and also what key components of both of them are?
But there are different topics on which I work. So if you want, I can maybe elaborate a bit that what is my research. And indeed, I try to look at whether laws in general, and European law, but also environmental law, specifically are in cope with what I define to be the criteria for sustainability that can be used to evaluate whether legal frameworks contribute rather than constrain the move toward a more sustainable society. So I work with a framework which is composed by 5 elements, being that of integration, so how the 3 P's of the sustainability paradigm, people, profit and planet, are balanced with each other. Looking also at the adaptability of law, so how law cope with changes in the 3 P's, balancing also in our understanding of how law is effective in protecting that balancing between the 3 P's. Then we have multi-level governance. They look at which level of government regulation should be passed and implementation should take place, with a favor for localism rather than globalism. Equity, so that there is intergenerational and intergenerational equity. And finally, there is public participation, so the democratic environmental process.
Looking at your most recent work, just going back to that 1 second, could you explain kind of what sustainability in your own words is, and how do you think it kind of interlinks with EU environmental law?
Yeah. But when I look at sustainability, I always start, first of all, to try to define it. And in defining sustainability, there are different sources, but the most used one is, of course, the Brundtland report, which focus on the balancing between the 3 P's, and of course the intra and intergenerational equity element, and so to fulfill the needs of today's society without endangering the ability of future generations to fulfill their needs. So that will be the basic element, but then we enrich it with further literature and insight on sustainability with the ecosystem approach and the concept of the resilience that is also coming from the ecosystem millennium approach. So these elements then compose the framework that I've just described of the 5 criteria: adaptability, integration, equity, participation, and multi-level governance, which then I use by zooming in and zooming out this framework to assess laws in general and environmental law in particular.
When did environmental law gain its significance, especially within the EU, and how would you say it presents in our society nowadays through the European Union?
Well, environmental law was officially recognized as a policy of the European Union in 1987 with the European Single Act, but it was already present in the European Union. There were already policy programs dating back, and the first directives are coming from the 60s, although we are not based on a fully fledged title and policy framework within the treaties. So it gained more and more relevance and explicit references and anchoring in the treaties over time, and we see nowadays that is developing one of the most abundant bodies of legislation adopted by the European Union. Of course, as any field of law which evolved over time, we can distinguish different phases of the maturity of the environmental law, and it started with very sectoral approaches, very focusing on one specific element or sector of the environment, be that water, air, for example, or industrial safety also being a sector, and now moving towards more integrated, more holistic approaches to environmental regulation. And we saw that starting in the 90s with Environmental Pollution Prevention and Control Directive, and now being still present today and guided by the principle of integration, which is enshrined in the treaties. If you ask me where we are today, although we have a vast body of legislation, we can still clearly recognize what are the biggest struggles of environmental law, namely being, on the one hand, a policy area of its own, but and in that sense not being fully integrated into other policy areas. So we have seen an increase in the holistic approach within environmental law and environmental policy, but we don't see this equal amount of holistic approach taking place when we look at EU law in general. We only with the Green Deal, we have the most recent approach to have a truly holistic approach to the energy transition and climate change problems and environmental law, and as well as economic developments. So the various policy areas of the European Union all being looking at together to address the issue.
That's a great answer, and thank you for shedding some light on the issue of environmental law to our listeners. To move on to more personal questions, maybe more personal opinions. Do you believe that environmental law as it is today is effectively protecting the environment? And a follow-up question, is it possible to achieve complete sustainability through laws and regulations of the European Union?
Yes, thanks for the question. Let's start defining effectiveness, because effectiveness is a buzzword, but it needs to be further refined to understand whether laws are effective or not. If we look at the level of legal effectiveness, so whether laws are clear and applied, you could say environmental law could become effective in certain areas, and others is more known and better applied than others, but legal effectiveness can be achieved. Then you have behavioral effectiveness, so whether the law is actually changing a behavior in the desired way among the subject laws aimed at regulating, be that legal or natural persons. Here we already see more problems taking place, and the pro-environmental behavior is still at times difficult to be recognized in several areas of society, but when we come to the final level of effectiveness, and probably the most important one, the real life effectiveness, so whether laws are capable of improving the public good they aim at protecting in the field of environmental law, environmental protection, then I'm afraid to say that environmental law is still far away from achieving that level. In certain areas, air quality law, we booked great improvements, but nowadays European environmental law is outdated, is looking back at standards coming from the 90s, although scientific community already improved the insights on the environmental criteria and requirement for a healthy environment from an air quality perspective, and European Union is not coping with that. Nature conservation is a drama. Biodiversity loss is still ongoing in the European Union. Water management is not improving to the desired level. In certain countries, it's going very poorly, such as in the Netherlands, for example. And when you look at climate change mitigation, I'm afraid that is a nice example of how law in the book and law in action, so legal effectiveness on the one end and real life effectiveness on the other end, are two completely different things around the risk of being disentangled, because we are not doing enough to prevent climate change.
So kind of looking at this problematic nature a little bit more closely, and also in the in a very recent conflict, I suppose, Germany has made its legislative goal to move towards renewable energies, which was now reinforced through the freezing of Nord Stream 2. Do you think that this is actually an achievable goal in the following years, this quickly? or do you think that it's not so achievable? Also keeping in mind that Germany is a very large country using large coal and large gas usages still nowadays, and it's basically relying upon non-renewable energies.
Yes, so if the question is whether we will be able to achieve the legal effectiveness in the sense that European goals for renewable energy are achieved, but it is not impossible. But of course, you will have many countries, such as Germany, will have to speed up their transition, especially now that we have also the international tumult caused by the war in Ukraine, and therefore some of the strategies that were envisaged by certain states, such as Germany, to transition their energy supply from carbon and nuclear to, especially for the field of heating, to natural gas, probably will need to be reconsidered, and it could be that we have a slowdown. On the other hand, the momentum could be used to further stimulate the building of renewable energy sources such as wind and solar energy. So it all depends on what are the reactions that politicians will put in place to the ongoing crisis, whether they will use this to steer towards more momentum and therefore extra investment in the field of renewables, or whether they will use it to actually back down from the indicated path. This does not take away the problem that the indicated path is just not ambitious enough to start with.
So, because you said that it's basically depending on politicians and countries in itself looking at which path they're going to choose, if they're going to move towards renewable energy sources or are going to stay in their path and trying to prolong their non-renewable journey, I want to almost say. France has also recently said that they're going to keep up the nuclear powers, they're going to keep them up for longer basically, and they're prolonging their non-renewable journey until I think 2035 they said, or something around that time. I'm not exactly sure with the facts, but I think, is that kind of a step backwards almost? Because it's not really moving towards the direction that we're all hoping it's going to go in.
No, indeed. That is an example of how politicians could actually use this phase of the transition, and this actually started before the war in Ukraine, but could be now further justified, to actually renegotiate what were the standards of renewable energy source or sustainability that were agreed upon. And just to give a more concrete example, EU taxonomy. It is a set of rules that try to define what is sustainable and therefore could be beneficial for investors to invest with if they want to have sustainable investment. Now there is the whole definition of whether nuclear energy and natural gas should be considered as sustainable or not. We've lobbied in the field of nuclear energy coming from France to actually considering nuclear energy more sustainable than considered in the past. So there you could see an example in which we could probably disentangle the law in the book and the law in action, the legal effectiveness and the real-life problem-solving effectiveness even further, which would probably be from the perspective of the environment and move backwards. But all of this, law is an instrument in the end of politics. It is also an instrument that can steer politics, so the two are in a symbiotic relationship. And all depends on the historical context in which you're looking at. So the one or the other could influence each other more. So it could be that environmental law and existing standards influence politics in the sense that they halt the movement toward a relaxation of the standards, but it could also be that politics at that point in time has the upper hand, and therefore it leads to a renegotiation of the legal standards or a disapplication of the standard to a certain extent, or so that different approaches are taken. So we are in a historical phase in which choices are being made, and in which afterwards we will have to see what kind of direction we actually took.
Just to ask a bit of a technical question to clarify what sources of renewable energy are and how they are classified from more renewable, as to say, and worse for the environment on the other end. Could you list maybe in the order from least sustainable to more sustainable what renewable energies are the best? Because we mentioned nuclear energy, and I think many people consider nuclear energy to be a very quotation marks green alternative.
Yeah.
And how is that compared to, let's say, solar energy or wind energy? If you could please clarify that a bit.
Yeah, but to start with, definitions are always important, and there is not a single, let's put it this way, all renewable energy sources or energy sources will always have some positive and negative consequence attached to it. If you really want to focus on what should be considered as renewable, in first instance, is something that does not make use of natural resources that are definitive in nature, and that with nuclear energy, now you can ask yourself whether the kind of molecules that are used to create plutonium and uranium are actually that kind of substances that are renewable of their own. So they are kind of limited in nature. Moreover, there is always some negative drawbacks, which is the nuclear scores and waste that is generated, although we are improving the way in which we are coping with them, and you could discuss whether actually the amount of nuclear waste generated from that kind of energy production is, generally speaking, so in absolute terms, so high that it should be considered to be a threat. But still, if you focus from the perspective of whether the source used to produce the energy is truly renewable, then solar, geothermal, aquatic resources, so wind energy, are intrinsically more green, more environmentally friendly than other sources of energy production. But of course, with all of them, you have to implement them so that you are not going to cause more environmental damage than other less renewable forms of energy. Think about wind energy. If you put the wind turbines in the wrong places, you could cause on the one end environmental harm, on the other end landscape pollution. Further, you could also affect human health. So there are several negative consequences related to wind energy production, which need to be taken into account in order to establish whether at the end of all this assessment that source of energy is truly more environmentally friendly than another one. Even hydro energy, well, it depends how you create it. If you have to build a dam and to do so destroy an ecosystem, in Greece we've had huge discussion about that in a lot of cases concerning exactly this kind of questions, then probably you will end up having a less environmentally friendly solution than if you had used a different kind of energy source. It seems, however, that we all agree that coal cannot be considered to be a very renewable energy source. So on the end of the scope of this ladder, there seems to be a bit more agreement that coal, from whichever perspective you want to look at, is not an environmentally friendly solution. But it is a short-term, affordable solution, that's for sure.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think it's a distinction that should be made for our listeners so they can better understand our conversation if they're not very versed in this subject, which I don't think we are very versed either. Everyone is learning today. So moving on to our next question. Unsurprisingly, lobbying is a factor that still very much hinders the EU Commission in proposing environmental legislation. So do you think that the EU is able to move away from this sometime in the future, and that the influence of lobbying groups from companies will decrease as time passes?
But lobby is a reality that is there, and you could even say that is part of democracy, because what is lobbying is basically let your opinion known to a responsible party. And there are some players that are much better organized and professionalized in that than others, lobbyists, companies, and they are therefore making it probably too successful use of what in itself is nothing else than the democratic right of making your voice heard by the regulators and responsible parties. So in that sense, probably the best way to go with lobby is actually to use it to your own extent. If companies are actually using it to halt environmental legislation, then make sure to use lobbying vis-a-vis the companies, like we are now doing, to put a lot of pressure on environmental friendly behavior by companies, to make sure that then there will be the one lobbying in favor of environmental protection among the European institutions. And of course, in between, you can always announce transparency, so to make sure that in any case there is a better understanding of why something was not pursued or was actually pursued at European level, so that you make sure that to trace back the interests that have shaped the outcome of decision-making power, and also to make sure that there is no corruption taking place, because expressing your voice and then convincing someone substantively that was a good idea, it's as such not in breach of democratic principles. but paying someone, so using extrinsic means to convince someone that they should do something, that is a problem. So in that sense, lobbying should be seen as something that can be steered, and that's something that should be regulated in order to make sure that it happens in a democratic way.
So I have a quick question about also kind of going to the topic of lobbying a little bit. Earlier you mentioned the European Green Deal right at the beginning, and I just wanted to kind of clarify what the European Green Deal for one is, because it's kind of like you said, the newly proposed legislation. It's I think it is legislation now as well since 2021, I want to say, almost.
Well, the Green Deal is first and foremost a policy document.
Yeah.
It is a policy document which is very encompassing and on the one hand set the ambitions of the European Union in the field of environmental protection, climate change, energy transition, circular economy. All these concepts are brought together in that document: sustainable farming, sustainable mobility. All these concepts come back in this big, all-encompassing policy document, which is then naturally translated into several packages of legislation from environmental perspective, but also in other sectors of European law. Just to understand an element, circular economy. Circular economy is all about a new approach to how we produce products and deal with the outcome of our consumeristic society, waste. If you do it only from an environmental perspective, you will never able to really set standards on the production of goods in such a way that more materials that are more open to being recycled or reused even are used in the production of products rather than others. So you really need also to involve the DG of internal market in the context of a policy spurring circular economy. And that is something that the Green Deal is bringing about. It's really empowering the various DG of the Commission to speak with each other in a way that they were not done so far, and in that sense stimulating therefore regulatory reforms and harmonization of standards in a broad range of European fields, not only in the environmental sector, although environmental law is the one that is moving the quickest with new EU climate law to begin with, but also many other reforms in the field of climate law legislation, and of course now they are following in other areas such as waste management and energy law.
This policy document, the European Green Deal, is one of the most lobbied topics at the moment. Do you think it can really be effective anymore now, given everyone has differentiating opinion on it and many companies kind of don't want it to be as effective? Do you think there is still a possibility that it can break through?
Yeah. Just a further clarification about lobbying and the effects of lobbying. They do not need to be negative.
Oh, yeah.
Think about circular economy. Circular economy is a concept that was developed in the Netherlands, and it was then lobbied from the Netherlands to the European Union. And the Dutch government was interested in doing that because the Dutch waste management industry was interested in that. They were just the one that thought, this could be a competitive advantage for us, therefore bring it forward. And that you could see that do not need to be always a conflict between economic interest, economic development, and environmental protection. They can go hand in hand, and also there is not an automatic equivalence between lobby and bad for the environment. We just have to steer the lobby towards more environmental friendly solution and higher level of environmental protection. Now, in the Green Deal, we saw that indeed certain ambitions were kept lower than what could have been because of lobbying. But on the other hand, we saw the resilience of certain European institutions, notably the European Parliament, which on the long run was actually able to rebalance the negative effects that lobbying had at the beginning. So in that sense, the Green Deal is as a whole probably not as bad as originally thought, and then in any case is bringing that shift in the governance approach, this more holistic approach about which I was referring before, that was very much needed to move towards more effective environmental legislation from whichever aspect you want to look effectiveness at. So it is not too bad.
Just because you mentioned the Netherlands already twice now, from what we know, the Netherlands has a good reputation regarding sustainability and ecology in general, especially because it's one of the countries that is most affected by rising water levels throughout Europe, out of all the member states of the European Union. So I was just wondering, as you mentioned the waste program that they have in the Netherlands, and that's clearly a good thing and they're very advanced in this aspect, but why do you think is the water management plan bad in the Netherlands? Because from what we have been hearing from our professors, it's actually a very important thing for them because of the canals and the amount of water that they deal with. Why is it not necessarily rising up to the standards?
All right, there were many topics mentioned in your questions. The last one concerned water management, and there is a difference between water management looks at two main components. On the one hand is water safety, and there the Netherlands is top of the class. And then there is water quality. And then on the field of water quality, the Netherlands is lagging behind, especially because they have so much modified water basins, a lot of canals you said, but also a lot of navigable rivers, that by now it is very difficult to bring them back to the standard of ecology and chemical status envisaged by the European Union. But I have to say that they are not really trying much to do that. So there you could see a difference in the perspective that you look at. Water safety, very good. The Delta program prevented the Netherlands from being flooded a few months ago, where we saw in Germany and in Belgium a lot of floods going on, but thanks to the measure that the Netherlands have been taken in that sense, did not happen again in the Netherlands. But water quality as such, so from a purely environmental perspective, that is not going well. Waste management, they are doing well. Why? Because at the end, the Netherlands is always good in focusing on all the sectors of the environment which has the most economic value. And waste management is about, goods. The safety of water is also about a lot of money. Quality a bit less. Biodiversity protection or nature conservation is a drama in the Netherlands. Why? Because it is not an economic rendable activity. Climate change, actually, from a climate change perspective, the Netherlands is lagging very behind. Why? Well, because they are not investing so much in renewables. And why? Well, because apparently that was not their main priority from a perspective of an economic growth. The Netherlands is very good in focusing on that aspects of the environment which are most intrinsically linked to the economic activities of the countries. In those areas in which there was historically less attention, they are still lacking behind.
Looking at more global environmental law, so moving a bit from the European Union, could you please explain to our listeners what COP26 or maybe COP26, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, is exactly and how it is used to align environmental legislation on a wider global scale?
Yeah. The Conference of the Parties, so COP meetings, are recurring meetings, basically yearly, in which indeed the various heads of state and other interested groups, speaking about lobby, that's all about lobby, from all sides, even from environmental NGOs, in order to indeed look at how the progress are taking place in the field of climate change. So it's very dedicated. It's not about all of environmental concerns, focus mostly on certain aspects of environment, and usually, since the last 2 decades, has been dominated from climate change rhetoric and perspectives, which is of course good, but then you could say that it plays other elements of environmental policy and protection at a different level, or just less, make them less relevant, at least in that forum. It is a meeting of the parties, so it's part of international politics, of international law. It is a moment in which the parties could see whether extra measures would be necessary, more binding agreement should be agreed upon, a reshaping of the standards should take place. So when we look at adaptability of laws, that are the forums, that are the moments in which international climate law can be adapted to new insights, new needs, in which the IPCC reports can be integrated into the legal standards, at least from an international law perspective, and then be used to follow up in the chain of decision making, entering in the European Union and national level, and there are finally the local levels of regulation. So in that sense, they are very important meetings, but they are first and foremost a place of negotiations, so of politics rather than law.
Okay, so last year was their the latest meeting that they had. Do you think that this kind of was able to achieve this adaptability of environmental policies that you spoke about just a second ago? Looking at, I know it's more a bit politics, not so much law, but just for some of our listeners, because I know loads of us are interested in it.
Yeah, well, the last meeting was in Glasgow. In that sense, it has not brought to a reshape of the standards, but in lobbying, it can always help at some spillover effect, in the sense that then action at other levels of governance, at European Union, at national level, can gain the momentum that we are losing just before the COP took place. So in that sense, it's always a moment to re-put the attention on the importance of acting towards climate change. We have to remember that the IPCC reports brought important updates to the foreground in this last 12 months. So in that sense that we now know even more than before how to withstand in the movement towards trying to avoid the increase of the global temperature to more than 1.5 or 2 degrees. But in that sense, the Glasgow meeting has not brought to a tightening of what was the Paris Agreement standard.
Okay, that's very interesting. So now moving a little bit more as well into global politics, international law a little bit. In your opinion, do you think environmental law is best regulated on a national or an international level? And do you think that international is even possible? Is that even achievable in the first place? Because there isn't this uniform body like the EU, this framework.
It's all a matter of proportionality and subsidiarity, you could say, regardless of whether these principles are looking at from specific frameworks such as European law and European treaties, or more just a general principle of law, because laws need to be able to achieve their goals, and that is the first element that you look at when you make legislation. And therefore, if the problem of environmental protection is a global one, you need a global action. There is no need to regulate, there is no purpose of regulating something locally if the cause of the environmental hazard is completely elsewhere. So that climate change is regulated internationally, just to give an example, is probably the only way to suitably deal with what is needed to tackle climate change. On the other hand, it makes no sense to only regulate it at international level if then the needed action has to take place at local level, or in any case national or European level. So you need a system of governance, the multi-level governance system, which enables the local dimension to connect with the international one and the other way around. So the whole chain in between are also aligned and enable the implementation and the setting of the standard to be this iterative process for micro to macro level, with the macro level in between, of course, so that the agreed action can be as effective as possible. This is something that will change on a base-by-base level. Soil protection is something that is seen traditionally as being very local. Noise protection is something that usually seen as being very local. So these are kind of areas of environmental law which makes most sense to be regulated locally rather than internationally.
As we have noticed in the last decades or so that Western countries move towards greener energies, especially now more than ever with the situation happening in the Ukraine and how Western powers want to kind of gain independence from Russia and its polluting resources. Many believe that third world countries should be criticized for their pollution levels due to the fact that most of their energy is sourced through polluting means, so for example coal. Can we even tackle the climate crisis if environmental standards are not upheld in the same manner everywhere in the world? And should Western powers have a duty towards less developed countries to aid them in achieving sustainability on the same level as the Western ones?
But there are, the concept of environmental. This question ties a bit with the previous one. So, what is the level of action that should take place for environmental law to be effective? And if we now focus on climate change, as I said, the it is a global problem, and therefore it needs to have a global action. But it's true that there are differentiated obligations in that area, and it is often discussed that it makes little sense to move towards renewable in Europe if in other developing countries, such as India, for example, the production of CO2 is still very high because of the high polluting substances. On the other hand, we have to consider that these countries could be helped moving towards a more sustainable behavior and therefore also a more sustainable energy mix by lowering the cost of the renewable energy sources, and therefore to creating economies of scales that will basically enable green electricity to be cheaper and therefore more affordable even for sustainable countries than grey energy. And here, developed countries play an important role. Certain technologies, and especially renewable technology, new innovations, are usually at the beginning of their lifespan quite expensive because a lot of development costs need to be recouped, it needs to be more efficient, and they have not achieved the level of production, of mass production, that allows to significantly lower the production cost. Now, developed countries are those countries which could be first mover and therefore help these new cleaner technologies to reach a massa which then enables them to lower the cost to such an extent they actually became attractive for sustainable countries as an altogether alternative to the, at the moment, cheaper but more polluting sources of energy.
So, looking at this global problem, global action kind of narrative that you just mentioned, we've heard that in the US, companies buy permits which are called pollution permits that legally allows them to pollute. Do you think that this is kind of a step towards that global action thing, or kind of away from that, and it's kind of not really aiding and bettering the bigger picture?
It depends on how the instrument is shaped. And having a permit or having a certificate that allows you to pollute could be a first step toward the internalization of costs. If it is only meant to allow sustainable and environmentally friendly behavior, no, it will not help. But if it is a first step or a further step in the process of internalizing environmental hazard, which is one of the main issues why we have pollution at first place, because the negative consequences of economic activities are paid by society or by the world rather than by the polluter, then it could help to move to a more environmentally friendly behavior. So it all depends on the way in which the permits have been shaped and what is the role that they should play in the global action towards more sustainable and more environmentally friendly behavior.
To sum this up, many of our listeners are actually really concerned about environmental law and its effectiveness, as we've been talking about for this whole interview. So, do you have any breakthroughs within EU environmental legislation that might give them some reassurance, that might help them being less scared about the climate change and its effects?
Well, the Green Deal is in that sense probably the most important breakthrough that we've had in the last years. It really links economic growth and investment in European Union to environmental protection, most notably climate change mitigation, which is a complete shift of paradigm in the way in which economy and environment were looking at before. So that is, in the sense, the most reassuring piece of development that we've had in the very recent past. Of course, in earlier we've had air quality legislation that has improved and extended the life expectation of humans greatly. You could say contributed probably to even more climate change because we live longer, so we have a higher footprint. But still, it was a great breakthrough in environmental legislation in order to move to a more a better world for at least for humans in that sense, and by extension, on the ends also for ecology more broadly. But the Green Deal is in the recent year the most important breakthrough because of its holistic approach, because it changed the narrative of how to look at environmental protection.
And to bring it back to our listeners even more and their sense of guilt with respect to environmental pollution and the climate change, should the burden be on citizens like you and me, who obviously they produce waste, to change their ways and try to make their practices be as carbon neutral as possible? Or should the burden be on the few companies that actually produce 90% of CO2 emissions and pollute the most?
it's on all of us. For economies of scale, you could say just focus the attention on the few big emitters or few big companies and force them to stop, Shell and all these other big oil producers that are usually mentioned in these kind of conversations. But let's be honest, if we just shower less longer or eat less meat, we already provide a good contribution towards mitigating climate change and forcing then a more sustainable behavior also on the side of the producer, because then is a market. But this doesn't mean, therefore, that you should wait for each other. Just do them both.
Perfect, thank you so much. So finally, we heard that the Department of Environmental Law is one of the most specialized departments in this field in the Netherlands. So we kind of asked us, all of our guests that come on, do you potentially have any positions open for students who are interested in helping you with your research, or if this is a possibility, how can they contact you?
Yes, to clarify, the department is of energy law, and that is indeed the most specialized department that we have in the Netherlands and to a great extent in Europe. In the field of environmental law, we have a lot of environmental specialists at the University of Groningen, but they are not really together in one department. They're spread around the various departments. We do have a Groningen Center of Energy Law and Sustainability. So in that sense, usually those who have affinity with environmental law are also part of that center. Now, the section of energy law is always looking for student assistance, so we have many cooperating with us already at the moment. For master students, we will increase that even more, in the sense that we will have even more practice-based approach in our master, creating even more chances for internships with the department or with our companies, but that takes place within the context. There are even a CTS allocated for of the energy and climate master that we have here, one of the best of the world, top 10. And more generally for bachelor students, it always is possible to come up, but there is not a lot of energy, climate or sustainability law embedded in the bachelor program. You only come across them sporadically during the research-based courses, a bit more on some Capita Selecta parts of a more mainstream course. So at this moment, there is not much attention to these themes in the field of our bachelors. So for bachelor students, it is a bit more difficult because you're not even familiar with the basic concept. Then look at that at our department.
Thank you so much, Dr. Squintani, for coming on to the podcast. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us. Very pleased on having you here today.
Yeah. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
And thank you for suggesting the Masters in Energy Law for fellow students. Maybe they will be interested after hearing.
Especially most of them are third years as well, so they're going into their Masters.
Yes, but let's start first with lobbying for more energy, sustainability and climate law at bachelor level.
Perfect, exactly. Thank you so much.
So lobby can be good. Bye, everybody.
So guys, that was the episode with Dr. Squintani today. We hope that you enjoyed it, and also this by no means was an introductory episode, we know that, and we're hopefully going to be able to either kind of have a little bit of an introduction to environmental law before this episode or after this episode, but bear with us because we have exams coming up, so we are stressed. But yeah, we hope that you enjoyed this episode today. Or we had exams.
At the time of the recording, we haven't had exams. So
this is in. Yeah, we're not gonna be posting them on the. There's a time schedule to all of this, so just bear with us. But hopefully there's gonna be an environmental law mini episode coming to you guys from us. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next episode. Bye, guys.